A man who keeps a weir learns to read water the way other men read faces. I had been doing it 40 years by the morning this story starts, and I could tell you the mood of the Corach flood lake by the sound the sluice made before I ever came round the shoulder of the embankment to look at it. That morning the sound was wrong. Not the fat, even chuckle of good water moving where it should. Something thick under it. A gulp. A thing caught. My name is Adler Voss. I kept the cell weir on the world we called them ble, out past the frontier registries where a man could go a season without seeing a face he hadn't seen the season before. Them ble was mostly water. The old surveys said it had been meant for more, that the terraforming had gone long and half finished, and then the funding had drowned same as everything else, and what was left was a flooded country of valley lakes and sunk forests and long gray mornings, where the mist came up off the water like breath off a sleeping animal. People lived there anyway. People always live anyway. Fisher crofts on the high ground, a few barge towns lashed to the old drowned steeples, and out at the neck of the Corach Basin, where the whole weight of 3 valleys pressed toward the lowlands, the cell weir. And me. The weir was an old thing, older than the registries, a long sweep of black stone and iron sluice gates that held the flood lake back off the crofts below. My whole work was to keep it breathing. Lift a gate when the rains came heavy, drop it when they eased, clear the grates of the drowned wood and the driftweed and the drowned things the lake gave up. It was not clever work. It did not pay. A younger man would have called it a punishment, and I suppose to the registries it half was. They posted the keepership to men they had no better use for, and I had been no use to anyone in particular for a long while by then. A keeper's day has no shape but the shape the water gives it. You rise before light because the sluice does not keep hours, and you walk the works in the cold reading the water off the sound of it, and you do the small endless labors that keep a big old thing from failing, the grease on the gate chains, the rust knocked off the winchpawls, the drift cleared, the low crofts kept dry and never knowing they were kept dry, because that is the whole art of a weir, that the people below it never once have cause to think of it. A keeper is a man whose entire success is that nobody notices him. I had made a life of not being noticed. I had got, I thought, quite good at it. I loved that water anyway. I will tell you the truth of it. I loved the long gray mornings and the sound of the sluice, and the way the mist lifted off toward noon and showed you the whole silver spread of the lake, ringed by the black stubs of the sunk forest, going quiet and bright all the way to the far shoulder where the deep water started. I loved the eel lines and the smell of the wet stone, and the particular gray gold the light went in the late day over the drowned trees. There was a place in the middle of the basin the old fisherfolk would not row over. They called it the Drown Deep, and they said it had no bottom, and they crossed 2 fingers over their hearts when they spoke of it and would speak of it no more. Once in my first years on the weir, a young fisher off the barge town had rowed out over it on a dare, drunk in the long light of a feast evening, and had come back white and quiet and would not say what he had seen or felt, only that the water had gone wrong under the boat, deep wrong, alive wrong, and that he would not do it again for any coin. I had thought him a drunk and a fool. I had kept that weir 40 years, and I had never once seen the bottom of the Drown Deep, and I had stopped, long ago, wondering what looked back up. I came round the embankment that morning with my great hook over my shoulder and my breath smoking in the cold, and I saw what had fouled the sluice. I thought it was a drowned beast at first, a big one. The 3rd sluice gate was choked to the top with drift, and the water was backing up brown behind it, and there in the churn was a long dark-shaped wound in the driftweed, half under, thrashing weak. I had pulled drowned deer and drowned draft toxin off those grates before, and once a whole raft of somebody's dead orchard, and my first thought was the plain keeper's thought, clear it before the backwater tops the low crofts. So I went down the wet stone with my hook, and I got a look at it and I stopped. It was not a beast I had a name for. It was longer than a man and better than half again as broad, and where the drift had torn away I could see it was scaled, not fish scaled, not the flat wet slick of a lake thing, but proper scale, each one the size of my thumbnail and laid like slate on a roof, a deep drowned green going to gray at the belly. It had a long neck and a long tail and a narrow head, and folded down its sides, pinned and tangled and useless in the weed, were wings webbed, finned, ribbed with pale bone, the trailing edges frayed and torn. Along its throat ran a row of gill slits, opening and closing, sucking, and its four legs ended in claws that had gone right through the iron grate mesh trying to hold on, and one of them was bleeding pale into the brown water. A drake, a water drake. I had heard the word my whole life the way you hear any old country word, in warnings, in curses, in the little rhymes the barge mothers sang to keep children off the deep water. Beware the deep, the drakes below, it takes the ones that lean too low. I had never believed there was a real animal under the rhyme any more than I believed there was a real bottomless hole under the drown deep. And here was one drowning on my weir. I should tell you what a sensible man does here, because I want you to understand I knew it. A sensible keeper drops the cull hook down through the mesh and opens the thing's throat and lets the current take it off the grate, and then he clears the drift and goes home to his stove. There was even a bounty. The registries paid in those years, a standing coin for any deep thing brought up dead off the floodworks, on account of the disappearances. Every few winters a fisher would go out over the deep water and not come back, boat and all, and the registries in their far offices had decided long ago that something in the lake was eating them, and they wanted it dead, and they would pay. I had the hook in my hand. I had the bounty coming. And the thing on the grate had stopped thrashing and gone still with the particular stillness of an animal that has decided the fight is done, and its gills were still going, open, closed, open, and one flat pale eye was turned up at me out of the water. The eye did not track me. I moved the hook and the eye did not follow it. I put my hand up and passed it slow across the drake's line of sight, and nothing in the eye changed at all. It was clouded, that eye, milk-white right across, and when I looked to the other side of that narrow head the far eye was the same. The animal was blind. Whatever it was, however it had been made to move through the black deep water where no light went, it was blind now, and it had come up out of the dark and fouled itself on a man's iron gate, because it could not see the gate and could not, I understood slowly, find its way back down. I want to be honest about why I did what I did, because the truth is smaller and stranger than the story would like. It was not courage. I was frightened of it, of the size of it, of the claws that had gone through the iron. It was not pity in the big soft sense either, not yet. It was that I could not stand to open the throat of a blind thing that had turned its face up to me and stopped fighting. That is all. I have opened a great many throats in a keeper's life, deer and oxen and the drowned sheep, and I had made my peace with all of them, but they had none of them looked up at me first, and none of them had been blind. I put the cull hook down on the wet stone, and then, because the backwater truly was rising and the low crofts truly would flood, I did the only thing left to a man who has decided not to kill the thing choking his sluice. I climbed down and started, by hand, to cut it free. It took me the best part of the morning. I cut the driftweed away in armfuls and let the current carry it through, and each time I freed a stretch of the drake it shifted its weight but did not turn on me, and I began, in the stupid way a man talks to a horse or a dog, to talk to it. Easy, easy now. There. I got the near wing loose and folded it against the body where it would not tear worse. I got a rope under the barrel of the thing and made it off to the gate post, so the current would not take it back down before it had its strength, because I could see it had no strength, that it was starved. That under the water-swollen look of it, the ribs stood out like the ribs of a wrecked hull. And last of all I worked the claws free of the mesh, one and then another, and the animal let me take its heavy cold foot in my two hands and free each claw as if it understood that my hands were the ones not hurting it. When the last one came loose it did not bolt. It floated in the slack water behind the gate on the end of my rope, gills going, blind face turned toward the place the sound of my voice was coming from, and it made a noise. I will not try to make that noise pretty for you. It was not a roar and it was not a cry. It was low, and it came up through the water more than through the air, a long descending note with a catch in the middle of it, and I felt it in the stone under my knees before I properly heard it. It was the sound a thing makes when it has given up hope and been handed a little of it back, and does not know what to do with the little. I had made a sound close to that myself once, a long time before, and had hoped no one heard. I heard this one. I stayed down on the wet stone a while longer than clearing the grate needed, and I did not think about the bounty at all. Now here is where a man's whole, quiet life turns without asking him. I meant to let it go. That was the plan, insofar as a stunned man has a plan. Get it loose, let it rest in the slack water, and when it had gathered itself it would slide back down to the deep, and I would clear the last of the drift and be a keeper again with a strange morning behind him. But it did not go down. It could not. I understood that by evening, when I came back to the gate with a lantern I did not light, because the Bible of my own long habit told me to save the oil, and found the drake still there on the end of the rope, still in the slack water, too weak and too blind to make the deep. It had tangled the rope round the gate post, keeping itself off the current. It was holding on to the one thing in the whole cold basin that had not hurt it. So I fed it. I did not have anything a drake eats, or I did not think I did, until I remembered the eel lines. I ran eel lines below the weir the way any keeper does, for my own pot, and I hauled them that evening, and there were 4 fat eels on them, and I carried them down, and I did not know how to give an eel to a blind, drowning drake without losing my arm. In the end I laid one on the flat of the wet stone by its head, and I made the noise back at it, the low sound, as near as an old man's throat could come, and I watched the narrow head turn and the gill slits flare and the thing find the eel by smell and by the ripple of it, and take it delicately off the stone, an inch from my hand, without once closing those jaws on me. It ate all 4. Then it made the low note again and put its heavy blind head down on the wet stone near my knee, the way a dog will, and I sat there in the cold and the coming dark with my hand not quite touching the cold scale of it, and I understood that I was not going to let it go, and it was not going to go, and that whatever this was, it had started. I called it Selk, after the weir, and because a keeper names the things he tends. It is not a grand name. It was never meant to be. The weeks that followed were the best of my later life, and I did not know it while I lived them, which I am told is the way of such things. I fed Selk every evening off the eel lines, and when the eel lines were not enough, I walked the Bargetown wharf and bought fish heads, and offal the fisher folk were glad to be rid of, and did not tell them what for. I moved Selk, over 3 cold days, out of the killing current below the 3rd gate and into the old flooded quarry pool at the north end of the works, where the water was deep and slack and warm off the sump, and where a blind thing could rest without being taken by the flow. I got a great deal of it wrong. I nearly drowned the both of us the first day, hauling on the rope. But Selk learned my hands and learned my voice and learned the flat stones I laid the fish on, and by the 2nd week it would come to the north edge of the quarry pool when it heard my boots on the plank walk, rising up out of the black water with the daylight running silver off the wet scale, blind face swinging to find the sound of me, gills flaring, and it would make the low note that I had come to understand was not fear at all but greeting. I learned it the way you learn any animal, slowly, and mostly by being wrong. I learned that the blindness was not from birth, because the milk in the eyes had a hard edge to it, an old scarring, and I came to think something had happened to it down in the deep, some hurt or some sickness, and that it had come up because a blind thing cannot hunt in a lightless deep, where even the seeing hunt by the faint glimmers, and it had been starving down there in the dark among its own kind, and had risen toward the one place the water grew warm and thin, and a helpless thing might find food, the shallows. The works, the weir. It had not come up to eat fisher folk. I never once in all those weeks saw in Selk anything that would eat a man. It flinched from noise. It flinched from the wharf-town rockets the fisher boys set off on feast nights. It was, under all that armored size, a frightened blind young thing, and it had thrown itself on the mercy of my iron gate because it had nowhere left. And it was young. I came to be sure of that too. It grew. In the weeks I fed it, it put on length and weight I could measure against the quarry stones, and the torn trailing edges of the wings knit and mended, and the pale starved gray went out of the belly scale and a deep living green came up in its place, and the low note got stronger, until some evenings it came up through the stone, and the plank and the soles of my boots, and I felt it in my teeth. A hatchling maybe, by the reckoning of its kind, or a little past. A child. I had fished a drowning child up off my own weir and called it a monster's name out of an old rhyme, and now I was raising it on fish heads in a quarry pool and talking to it in the evenings about the state of the sluice and the price of eel and the long ago. The way a man talks to the one thing that will not talk back and will not leave. There is a thing that happens between a man and an animal he feeds every day at the same hour, and it happened between me and Selk, and it is not friendship exactly, and it is not ownership, and there is no clean word for it. It is that you become, to the animal, the shape the world makes when it is about to be kind. Selk learned my hour. Not my face. It had no face of mine to learn, but my hour and my step, and the particular knock of my boot heel on the third loose plank of the north walk, and it would be up out of the black water, and at the shelf before I came round the last of the quarry lip, hanging in the water with its blind head lifted, and its gills wide, waiting, and I found I could not be late. On the mornings the sluice needed me first, and Selk went hungry an hour past its hour. I felt it the whole time I worked, a small pull, like an unpaid debt, and I hurried the sluice work to get to it, and that is a thing I had not felt about any living creature in longer than I would say. It is a good thing to be waited for. I had forgotten. A man alone at a weir 40 years forgets a great many small good things, and does not know he has forgotten them until one comes back. I taught it, without meaning to teach it anything, to come to a whistle. I would whistle, low 2 notes coming down the walk, and by the third week the whistle would bring the green length up out of the deepest corner of the quarry before I'd even laid the fish on the stone, and by the 5th week I had only to think about whistling, or so it felt, and Selk would rise, having heard, I suppose, the boot on the plank, but it felt like more. It felt like being known, and I let it feel like more. I was a lonely old man. I will not pretend I policed the feeling. I learned its body the way you learn a horse's, where it liked to be touched, and where it did not. It did not like a hand come down on it from above. The first time I tried it the whole length of it flinched and went under, and I understood later that a thing from the lightless deep knows a hand from above as the hand of the thing that hunts it, that comes down out of the bright killing water on top of you. But a hand laid flat along the jaw, coming in level slow from the side where it could feel me coming through the water before I touched, that it leaned into. It leaned into it the way a cold thing leans toward a stove, and the scale, which looked like slate and felt from a distance like armor, was warm under the sun-warmed skin of my palm, and had a give to it, a life, and along the jaw and under the throat where the gill ridges ran it was soft as the belly of a fish. And Selk would let me lay my hand there and would go still and make the low note so quiet it was more felt than heard, and we would stay like that, the two of us, in the cold bright morning, for as long as I could spare and sometimes longer. I should say plainly that I was not a soft man and had not had a soft life, and that I am not telling you I wept over a drake in a quarry pool every evening like something out of a barge mother's song. Most evenings I sat on the cold stone and threw fish and watched the mist and thought about the weir. There was work in it, real work, the offal to buy and haul, the quarry gate to run so the sumpormth held, the eel lines to tend twice as hard now they fed too, and a man does not sentimentalize the animal he is breaking his back to keep alive. But there were evenings. There was the evening Selk, having eaten, did not put its head down to sleep, but instead slid the whole long length of itself up onto the flat quarry shelf where I sat, dripping, enormous, and laid its blind head across my legs, so that I could not have risen if the whole lake had come over the weir and breath there slow, the gills gone still and the lungs working instead, warm, and made the low note once, low, and slept. I sat under the weight of it in the cold, with the mist coming up silver off the water and the daylight going long and gray gold over the drowned forest, and I did not move for a long time, and I will not tell you what an old keeper thought about, sitting there. It is not the sort of thing that goes into a story. But I will tell you, it was the first thing in a great many years that had needed me and known me for the one that fed it, and that when it laid its head down, it laid it down trusting. And a man can go his whole life and not be trusted like that by anything. And I had it now off a blind drake in a flooded quarry, and I was not fool enough to think it was nothing. I had a wife once. That is the part I will put in and no more of, because a man tells a story to say a thing sideways he cannot say straight. Her name is not for this. She had been dead a long time by the year the drake came up on my weir, and I had come out to the frontier and taken the loneliest posting the registries had, and I had told myself and anyone who asked that I liked the quiet, and it was even true mostly. But a man who has been needed once, and then not needed by anything at all for 20 years, carries the not being needed around like a stone he has stopped noticing he is carrying, and it is only when someone takes it off him, some blind starved thing that comes up his sluice one gray morning and waits for his boot on the plank, that he feels the place where it was, all raw and light and strange. That is what Selk did, that it never knew it did. It gave me back the weight of being waited for, and it took away the other weight, the stone, without either of us saying a word about it, because it had no words and I had too many and none of them any good. The trouble came the way trouble comes, from the ordinary side. A barge town does not keep a secret. By the 5th week, the fisher folk knew the cell keeper was buying offal he didn't eat and running the north quarry gate strange, and one of them had rowed close enough one dawn to see a green armored length rise out of the quarry pool to a man's whistle. And after that they knew altogether, and after that the registries knew, and after that they sent a warden. Her name was Kjol Harren, and she was a cull warden out of the lowland office, sent up the flood road on the registry's coin to see about the deep thing the cell keeper was said to be harboring. And I want to be fair to her, because she was not a cruel woman, and she was not wrong to come. She had a young face gone hard early, the way faces go hard in that work, and she had lost people to the deep herself. A brother, she told me later, off a barge over the drown deep, boat and all, never a plank of him found, and she carried the standing bounty writ in a waxed roll inside her coat, and a long cull lance across her back with a head on it made for exactly the throat I had chosen not to open. She came up the plank walk in the gray morning, and she stood at the edge of the north quarry, and she looked down at Selk, who had risen at the sound of strange boots and hung in the black water with its blind face swinging, uneasy, and she said, not unkindly, "Keeper, you know what that is." "I know what the rhyme says it is," I said. "It takes people off the deep," she said. "Whole boats. My office has a stack of writs this high of fishers gone over the drown deep and never come up, that thing or its like." "This one's a blind child," I said, "and it's eaten fish heads off my hand for 5 weeks and never so much as bared a tooth at me. Whatever takes your boats, it isn't this." She looked at me a long time, and I could see her weighing it, the old keeper's word against the writ, against the brother off the deep, against the long stack of the drowned, and I could see, too, that she wanted to believe me and could not afford to. "Show me," she said. "Show me it won't." So I did. I went down the plank walk to the shelf with the warden at my shoulder and her hand not far from the lance, and I whistled, low, 2 notes, and Selk came up out of the deep corner and to the shelf as it always did, and it heard the second boot, the strange boot, and it stopped a length off and hung there in the water with its blind head weaving, uneasy, gills flaring. And I laid a fish on the flat stone the way I did every evening, and I made the low note, and I put my hand out flat and level from the side, and I waited. The warden did not breathe. I could feel her not breathing. And Selk came in, slow, blind face swinging to be sure of me, and it took the fish off the stone an inch from my hand, delicate, and then it did the thing it did, laid the flat of its jaw into my open palm and leaned, and made the note so quiet you had to be me to feel it, and held there, trusting, a hand's breadth from a cull warden with a lance, and did not know she was there at all except as a wrongness in the air it had decided on my account to bear. Kjol Haran let her breath out slow. She took her hand off the lance. She did not say anything for a while, and when she did her voice had changed. "It doesn't know I could kill it," she said. "No," I said. "It knows I won't let anything." "You can't promise that." "No," I said. "But it doesn't know that either." And she looked at me and at the blind head leaning into my hand, and something went across her hard young face that I would not insult by nomming, and she stepped back, careful not to scare it, and went back up the walk. But she did not tear up the writ, and I did not ask her to, because I understood the shape she was caught in as well as she did. "It grows," she had said, and it did. "You can see it's grown. You know what it grows into." And she was not wrong about that either. I did not know what Selk grew into. I had told myself in the good evenings that I would deal with that when it came, and I had known, in the bad ones, that a thing that grew that fast in a quarry pool would one day be too big for the pool, and too big for the weir, and too big for a keeper's fish heads, and that the question I had put off would not put itself off forever. A blind thing that could not hunt, growing toward the size of a barge, penned in a keeper's quarry. I had not let myself do the arithmetic of it, and she had done it for me, out loud, standing at the edge of the water, and there was no unhearing it. She gave me till the turn of the season. That was more than her writ required, and I knew it, and she knew I knew it. Till the turn of the season, and then the cull lance, unless I could show her the thing was no danger, which was a thing I did not know how to show. She went back down the flood road that same day, and I stood on the weir and watched the flood road until she was gone off it, and then I went down to the shelf and sat a long time and did not feed Selk yet, though it was the hour, because I could not, just then, look at the trusting blind head and think about the lance and the turn of the season both at once. The days after were the hardest of the whole season, harder than the first cold morning, because now there was a clock on it. I fed Selk, and I ran the sluice, and I hauled the offal, and I did all of it with the turn of the season sitting on me like weather. I thought about running it off, loading it somehow onto a barge, and carrying it 3 valleys over to some other deep water, and turning it loose where no writ ran. And I knew even as I thought it that it was a fool's plan, that a blind drake could no more make a living in a strange deep than in this one, that I would only be carrying it off to drown somewhere the fisher folk had not yet learned to leave it alone. I thought about the deep, about whether, if I could only get it strong enough, it might find its own way back down to wherever it had come up from, and every evening it grew stronger, and every evening it did not go, because it could not, because a blind thing cannot cross a half-mile of killing shallow water alone in the dark, and find the one place the bottom falls away. I had saved it from drowning on my gate, and I had, in the saving, penned it in a place it could not leave and could not stay. That is the thing about a kindness done without a plan. It runs on ahead of you and gets you into country you did not mean to enter, and there is nothing to do then but keep walking and hope the country has a far side. And that evening, I have told it out of order, I will set it right, that evening near the end, with the turn of the season close and no plan in me, I sat on the cold quarry shelf, and Selk laid its head across my legs, and I put my hand on the warm green scale of its brow, and I said out loud into the mist, "I don't know what to do with you." And Selk made the low note, and out on the lake, far out, over the black water where the drown deep started, something answered. I felt it before I heard it, the way you feel a barge come in at night, the water changing against the works before the sound of it reaches you. The whole flood lake shifted. A long swell came up out of the deep and rolled the length of the basin and lifted the surface of the north quarry and set the plank walk creaking. And out where the mist lay thick over the drown deep, the mist stirred, moved, as if something the size of a barge town had passed just under it, unhurried, and gone down again. And Selk under my hand went very still, and then lifted its blind head off my legs and turned it out toward the deep, and made a sound I had not heard it make before, not the low greeting note, but a rising one, thin, reaching, a call, and out across the black water, faint, far down, the deep called back. I did not sleep that night. I sat on the shelf with my back to the cold quarry stone, and Selk hung in the water at my feet with its face turned always out toward the deep, calling now and again, low and being answered, and I understood, the way you understand a thing you have been refusing to understand, that Selk had people. That the rhyme and the writ and the stack of the drowned had all been circling in their frightened human way around a true thing after all, that there was something down in the drowned deep, something vast, a whole world of them maybe, down in the lightless deep where the water had no bottom, and that they had lost this one. A blind child of theirs had gone up starving into the killing shallows where the iron gates and the cull lances waited, and they had not been able to follow it up into the thin, bright, dangerous water where men were, and they had grieved it, I think, the way you grieve a thing gone up into a country you cannot go. And now, faint on the far edge of hearing, they had heard it call, alive. I have thought a great deal in the years since about what happened next, and I have never been able to make it small. I will only tell it plain. At dawn the mist over the drowned deep did not lift. It thickened, and it moved, and the water under it began to rise, not a flood, not a wave, but a slow doming of the whole surface, a great smooth swell mounding up over the deep, as if the lake were being lifted from below on the back of something rising, and I stood on the weir in the gray light with my heart going, and I watched the deep queen come up out of the bottomless water of them bleh. I do not have the words for the size of her, and I will not insult the truth by pretending I do. Selk was longer than a man and better than half again as broad, and had seemed enormous to me for 5 weeks, and the thing that came up under the mist made Selk a minnow. She broke the surface far out, first the long ridge of her back, streaming black-green, ancient, scaled in plates the size of barge decks, weeded and barnacled with the growth of a life longer than the registries, longer than the drowning of them bleh, longer maybe than men on that world at all. Then the slow rise of her neck and her head which came up streaming out of the deep and turned, and I saw that her eyes were not clouded. She could see. She was old past counting, and she was not blind, and she turned her seeing eyes across the whole silver basin, and found, on the little black line of the weir, one small warm man standing at the north quarry with a blind child of her deep hanging in the water at his feet, and she came on. She came slow. I will always be grateful in a way I cannot explain that she came slow. She could have come like the flood and taken the weir and the barge town and the whole basin down into the drowned deep in a single roll of that vast body, and instead she came slow, up the deep water and into the shallowing basin, her wake a long smooth swell that lifted the fisher boats gently at their moorings and set every barge in the town rocking, and did not swamp a single one. And the fisher folk came out onto the wharves and the barge roofs and stood and did not run. Because there was nowhere to run to, and because, I think, they understood the same thing I was beginning to understand, that this was not the taking they had feared for 100 years. She came up the basin until the deep gave out under her, and she could come no further without grounding that vast body in the shallows, and there she stopped, half a mile out, her head raised up out of the water higher than the drowned steeples, and she looked at the weir and she called. It went through everything, through the water and the stone and the bones of the works and the bones of me. A long low note, the same shape as Selk's greeting but grown vast and ancient and full of a grief I had no right to understand and understood anyway. And at my feet Selk rose up out of the quarry water tall as it could rise and called back, that thin rising reaching call, over and over, blind face straining out toward the mother it could not see. And the whole basin rang with the two of them, the vast one and the small one, calling across the water they had been divided by. And I stood between them on the cold stone with the daylight coming up silver and gold over the mist, and I wept, which I had not done in front of anything living in longer than I will tell you. Here is the part the rhymes never had, and the writs never had, and the frightened stack of the drowned never had. The deep queen did not take her child and go. She could not come to the weir, the shallows would have grounded and killed her, and Selk, though it strained, could not make the deep on its own, too weak still and too blind to cross the killing shallows alone. Half a mile of bright water lay between the mother and the child, and neither could close it. And the old queen, raised up out of the deep with her seeing eyes, turned them not on her child but on me, on the small warm thing standing on the black line of the weir, who had, for 5 weeks, been the only bridge across that water there was. I understood what was needed. I do not know how I understood it, except that I had spent 5 weeks learning to read one drake and 40 years learning to read water, and between the two I understood. Selk could not make the deep alone, but it could make the deep lead. It had crossed the killing shallows once, up the current onto my iron gate, hurt and blind and starving, and it could cross them again down out, toward the deep and the mother's voice. If there was a hand it trusted to put it in the water and point it true, and a voice it knew to send it off. There was one such hand and one such voice on all of them, bleh, and they were mine. So I did the last keeper's work of that whole long strange season. I went down into the cold water off the north shelf, up to my chest, with my arms around the barrel of a blind young drake that had grown in 5 weeks to more than I could rightly hold, and I walked it out. Off the shelf, along the drowned quarry lip, out past the third gate into the open basin where the swell of the deep queen's rising still ran, and Selk let me, floated in my arms and let me, blind and trusting, the low note going in its throat against my chest the whole way, and I aimed its narrow head out along the bright water toward the vast dark shape in the calling, and I put my mouth by the place I thought it heard from, and I said the only true thing I had left to say to it. Go on now. She's there, and she's yours, and she came all this way up out of the dark for you, and you go on and you don't look. And then I stopped, because it could not look, and I laughed, a broken old wet laugh out there chest deep in the cold with the whole basin ringing, and I said instead, go on and hear her. Go to the sound. I've got you pointed true, and I let go. It went. It caught the mother's call, and it went, low in the water, sure now, no longer thrashing but swimming, driving, the mended wings opening under the surface and beating slow. Out across the killing shallows it could not have crossed alone, out toward the deep, and the deep queen lowered her vast head to the water as it came and made the low note steady and unbroken, a sound to steer by, a lighthouse made of grief and gladness for a blind child to swim home along. And I stood chest deep in the cold flood lake of Korach, and watched a monster from the drowned deep bring her drowned child up out of the shallows on a rope of her own voice, and I have never in my life seen anything I would trade the sight of. Selk reached the deep water. I saw the moment it felt the deep open under it, the moment the bottom fell away, and the cold true dark it was made for came up to meet it, and it sounded, dove the long green length of it rolling under and gone, down toward the vast dark shape, and the deep queen turned her great head down after it. And for a moment the two of them were together under the water, the small returned to the vast, and the whole basin was quiet. Then the deep queen rose again, and she turned, that ancient seeing head, streaming back across the half-mile of bright water, and she found me, standing chest deep and shaking with cold and with the other thing, an old keeper who had lost the one thing that had needed him and given it up on purpose and was glad and was breaking. She found me and she came. I did not run. I want to say it was courage, and it was not. My legs would not have carried me if I had asked them. She came slow, up the shallowing water as far as the deep would let her, until her raised head hung over the weir over me, blotting the gray morning, close enough that I could see the barnacle and the weed of ages on the plates of her, close enough that her breath came down over me warm and vast and smelling of the deep, and she lowered that head until one enormous seeing eye, dark and ringed with gold and old past all my reckoning, was level with the small cold man standing in the water. And she looked at me, not the way you look at prey, not the way you look at a man, the way, I have only this to compare it to, the way a mother looks at the stranger who carried her child in from the storm, all the grief gone out of it and something else come up in its place that I have no word for except the old word, the plain one. Thanks. She looked her thanks at me, the deep queen of them, bleh, out of an eye older than my whole drowned world, and I stood in the cold water and I could not speak, and I did the only thing a keeper knows to do before a thing so far above him. I bowed my head. And she did not want it. That is the part I have never been able to make small. She did not want the bowed head. She made a sound, low, close, a different note, and I looked up because I could not help it, and she had put the flat of her great streaming brow down, not on me, that would have driven me under, but down low to the water beside me, offered, the way Selk had laid its head across my knees on the good evenings. The exact same gesture grown vast and ancient and impossible, the mother making the child's gesture of trust to the man who had earned it. And I understood that I was not to bow to her. I was to lay my hand on her, the way I had laid it on her child, because to her that was the truer thing, not a subject before a queen but the keeper before the thing he had tended, and she had come up out of the bottomless deep of the world to be, for one moment, tended. I put my hand on the brow of the deep queen of them ble. It was cold and vast and hard as the black stone of my own weir, and it was alive under my palm the way the whole lake was alive, and she held still for it, still as Selk had held still to have its claws freed off the iron, and the low note went through her and through the water and through me, and out at the deep the water stirred, and I understood dimly that we were not alone, that below the queen in the black water of the drowned deep the whole sunk flight had risen to the edge of the deep to see it. 100 dark shapes hanging just under the bright shallows where they could not come, watching the small warm keeper lay his hand on their queen's brow, and that whatever the drakes of them ble had thought of men before that morning, and they had had 100 years of writs and cull lances and bounty hooks to think it, was, in that moment being unthought, remade, into this. Then she lifted her head slow, and the water ran off her in sheets, and she turned, and she went down. The vast body rolled under, and the swell of her going ran the length of the basin one last time, and lifted the fisher boats gentle at their moorings, and the mist closed over the drowned deep, and the flood lake of Korech went quiet and silver and bright all the way to the far shoulder, and I stood chest deep in the cold with my hand still out where her brow had been, and it was over, and I was alone at my weir the way I had been for 40 years, and I was not ever again alone in the same way. Kjol Heron came back at the turn of the season, as her writ said she must, up the flood road with the cull lance across her back, and she stood at the north quarry where there was no drake any more, and she looked at the empty water a long time. I told her the whole of it. I did not expect her to believe it, and I think in the ordinary run of things she would not have, warden that she was, with her waxed writ and her stack of the drowned. But there had not been a fisher taken off the drowned deep since the morning the queen rose. Not one that season, nor the next, nor any I heard of after. The barge town, which had lost a soul to the deep near every winter in living memory, stopped losing them. And the fisher folk, who are not fools whatever the registries think, drew their own quiet line between the morning the cell keeper walked a blind drake out into the shallows, and the day the drowning stopped, and they did not need the whole story to honor it. They left things at the north quarry, some of them, on feast days. A fish laid on the flat stone. It was foolish and it was kind, and I never told them to stop. Kjol did not file the writ. She stood at the empty quarry, and she took the waxed roll out of her coat, and she looked at it a long moment, and she put it back, and she said, "My brother went over the drowned deep 11 years ago." And I said I knew, she'd told me. And she said, "If they don't take people any more." And she did not finish it, and she did not have to. She was asking whether the thing that had her brother had ever been what she thought it was, or whether the deep had only ever been the deep, dangerous the way water is dangerous, and the drakes below it grieving their own the same as she grieved hers. And I told her the truth, which was that I did not know, that I had known one blind child and one vast mother and nothing else of the whole sunk world under the lake, and that the one thing I could swear to was that neither of them, given the chance to take a small warm man off the black line of the weir, had done anything but lay their heads down to be touched. She thought about that a long time. Then she shouldered the cull lance and went back down the flood road, and I heard, years later, that she'd left the culling work altogether and gone to keeping a weir of her own, 3 valleys over, and I have always been glad of that, and have always thought I understood it. I kept the cell weir 11 more years. I am too old for it now, and there is a younger man on the gates, a good one, who thinks the old keeper is a little strange about the North Quarry and humors him. I still go down to the water in the gray mornings. I still read the mood of the lake off the sound of the sluice before I come round the shoulder of the embankment. And now and again, not often, once or twice a season maybe, in the good gray light with the mist coming up silver off the deep, the water out over the drown deep will stir, and dome, and a long green length will rise up out of the bright shallows to the edge where the deep gives out, grown near as vast as its mother. Seeing again, I have to believe, or near enough to find its way, the old scarred milk gone out of the great dark eyes, and it will hang there in the water a while, out past where any man could reach it, and turn its head toward the little black line of the weir, and make the low note, the greeting note, the one it made off my iron gate the first cold morning when I put the cull hook down. And I stand on the weir I have kept my whole life, an old man at the bottom of every hierarchy the registries ever drew, and I make the note back at it as near as an old throat can come. And that is all. That is the whole of it. There is no more to the story than a blind child fed off a man's hand, and a deep that remembered it and rose. But I will tell you, the way I would tell any man who has kept a lonely work at the edge of a world and wondered if the small kindness he did there was ever seen by anything at all. It was seen. It was all of it seen. The deep has no bottom and it forgets nothing, and it came up once, the whole vast grieving grateful weight of it, to lay its head down by the hand that fed its child, and a man who has had that does not need the rest. The mist lifts toward noon, the way it always has. The lake goes bright and quiet all the way to the far shoulder, and out over the drown deep, where the fisher folk still will not row, the water keeps its ancient patient counsel, and holds its dead and its living both, and holds, I have to believe, in whatever the deep keeps for a memory, one gray morning and one small warm hand and one blind child brought home, and holds it kindly. That is the thing I did not know, all the years I kept the weir and thought no one was watching. It was watching. It was always watching. And when the moment came for it to answer the smallest kindness a small man ever did, it did not come up to take. It came up to thank him,